The jewelry box was warm in my hands, still holding the faint ghost of her perfume, and inside, tucked beneath the velvet lining exactly where she'd always said it would be, I found a slip of cream-colored paper, folded into a square so precise it must have taken her minutes. I unfolded it. For my real daughter. I read it 7 times, standing in the middle of her empty bedroom, the afternoon sun cutting through the blinds and striping the hardwood in gold. 7 times because my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were reporting. This was the jewelry box my mother had pointed to on my 6th birthday, when I'd reached for a bracelet on her dresser and she'd laughed and said, "One day, Claire, one day all of this will be yours. You're my only girl." I had built a small, secret cathedral around that promise. Every Mother's Day card I'd ever picked out, every Sunday dinner I'd hosted in my own home because she didn't like restaurants, every time I'd let her correct my parenting in front of my own children and swallowed the response that sat burning on my tongue. All of it had been bricks in that cathedral. All of it had been me, trying to be the daughter she deserved. And the whole time, she'd had a different daughter in mind. I want to pause here for just a second, because I know some of you listening have a box of your own. Not necessarily a jewelry box. Maybe it's a letter, or a silence, or a look your mother gave you across a crowded room that told you everything you were afraid to know. If that feeling just surfaced for you, you're not alone. This channel exists for exactly that moment. Dee leans in now, voice dropping just slightly, because this isn't a performance, it's a recognition. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. So if you need to hit pause, collect yourself, and come back, I'll be right here. But don't leave the fire just yet, because what my mother had set in motion was far bigger than a note in a box, and I think you need to hear how it ended. My mother, Patricia, was the kind of woman people described as formidable and meant it as a compliment. She chaired committees, she remembered birthdays, she sent thank you notes on heavy cardstock within 48 hours of receiving a gift, which she then critiqued privately. I loved her deeply, and also, if I'm honest, I feared her just a little. The way you fear someone who holds the keys to a room you're never quite sure you've been invited into. My father had passed 12 years earlier, quietly and without drama, the way he'd done everything. After that, it was just the two of us. I was her emergency contact, her medical proxy, the person who drove her to colonoscopies and sat in the waiting room with a coffee that went cold while I answered work emails on my phone. I didn't resent it. She was my mother. That was the equation. What I didn't know, what I had never even suspected, was that my mother had another child. A daughter she'd given up for adoption before she married my father. A daughter she'd found again, quietly 12 years ago, the same year we buried my dad. A daughter named Valeria, who lived 3 states away and who, according to the letters I would later uncover, had been receiving birthday cards, Christmas checks, and long, handwritten confessions of regret every single month for more than a decade. While I was scheduling her mammograms, Valeria was getting the poetry of her heart. The jewelry box was a vintage mahogany piece with brass hinges, lined in burgundy velvet that had worn soft as suede over 60 years. It had belonged to my grandmother, then to my mother, and it was supposed to come to me. The note made clear that it wouldn't. What it didn't make clear, what I wouldn't understand until the lawyer called 3 days later, was that the jewelry box was only the beginning. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before the will, before the lawyer, before I learned the full architecture of what she'd built, there was the funeral. And at the funeral, I met her. Valeria was standing in the back of the church in a black dress that looked expensive and new, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. And when she caught my gaze, she smiled at me like we were already sharing a secret. I didn't know yet that the secret was me. The funeral ended the way all funerals do, with lukewarm coffee in a church basement and people saying things like, "She's in a better place," while balancing paper plates of lemon bars. I moved through it in a fog, my handshake automatic, my smile a reflex I'd learned from the very woman we were burying. Valeria stayed on the periphery the entire time, never approaching me directly, never introducing herself, just watching. Watching me the way someone watches a house they've already made an offer on. I should have known then. But grief has a way of dulling your instincts, and I was so full of grief I couldn't feel the edges of anything else. That night, back in my own kitchen, I set the jewelry box on the counter and stared at it under the fluorescent light. My husband, Tom, came in around 11. I handed him the note without a word. He read it, looked at me, read it again. "Claire," he said, and then he stopped. Because what do you say to your wife when she's just learned her entire childhood was apparently a placeholder? He pulled out a chair and sat beside me, and we stayed there until the coffee went cold and the clock read 2 in the morning. Tom is a good man, but even good men cannot undo what a mother has done. The next morning, a Wednesday, I started going through her papers. I told myself I was being practical. Bills needed paying, accounts needed closing, the machinery of death requires paperwork. But I was also hunting. I needed to know who Valeria was, how long my mother had known her, how deep the secret went. I found the first letter in a cedar chest in the hall closet, tied with a pale blue ribbon. It was dated 12 years ago, just 3 weeks after my father's funeral. "My dearest Valeria," it began, "I have carried you in my heart every single day since I let you go. Please let me make things right." The handwriting was my mother's, that elegant, slanted cursive I'd admired as a girl. The same hand that had written notes excusing me from gym class and signed every birthday card with "Love always, Mom." Love always. I learned later there were 47 of those letters. 47. I also found the checks. 12 years of monthly checks for $1,500, every single one cashed. $180,000, give or take, sent to a woman I'd never met while I paid for my mother's prescriptions out of pocket because she said her fixed income was tight. She wasn't lying, exactly. Her fixed income was tight. She'd fixed it to flow directly to Valeria. I remember sitting on the floor of that closet, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's secret life, and feeling something strange settle over me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a puzzle you didn't even know you were solving finally snaps into place. All those years of feeling like I was auditioning for a role I'd already been cast in. The way my mother would look at me sometimes, almost quizzically, as if she were comparing me to someone else and finding me slightly off. The distance I'd attributed to her generation, her reserve, her grief over my father. It had never been any of those things. She had simply been loving someone else the whole time. 3 days after the funeral, the phone rang. It was a lawyer, a man named Robert Hendricks, with a voice like gravel and honey. He informed me that my mother's will was to be read the following Monday, and that I was required to attend. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that a Ms. Valeria Santos had also been notified and would be present. He said it casually, the way you'd mention the weather, and I realized in that moment that he knew. He had known about Valeria long before I did. He had probably drafted the letters, or the checks, or whatever legal architecture my mother had built around her second life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying every interaction I'd had with my mother over the last decade, searching for cracks in the facade and finding them everywhere. The time I'd asked if I could have my grandmother's china and she'd changed the subject. The birthday dinner where she toasted to family, however we find it, and I thought she was being philosophical. The way she'd never quite answered when I asked, as a teenager, if she'd ever wanted more children. I had built my entire sense of self on the belief that I was enough for her, that my presence, my care, my loyalty had filled whatever space a daughter was supposed to fill. And the whole time, that space had been reserved. I had been, at best, a stand-in. Monday arrived gray and cold, the kind of March morning that refuses to commit to spring. I dressed carefully. Navy blazer, simple earrings, the necklace my father had given me when I graduated college. Tom offered to come. I told him I needed to do this alone. The law office was in a converted Victorian on the edge of town, all mahogany paneling and leather chairs and the faint smell of old paper. Valeria was already there when I arrived, seated in the waiting area with her ankles crossed and a folder in her lap. She smiled at me again, that same knowing smile from the funeral, and I felt something cold slide down my spine. I did not smile back. Robert Hendricks ushered us into a conference room and closed the door. He opened a leather-bound folder and began to read. My mother's last will and testament was 10 pages long. It took him 23 minutes to get through it. When he finished, I understood that my mother had not simply preferred Valeria. She had erased me entirely. The house, the savings, the investments, the car, everything went to Valeria. The jewelry box was mentioned by name, bequeathed to my firstborn daughter Valeria as a token of my undying love. The note I'd found inside, for my real daughter, had not been an accident. It had been a message, one I was never supposed to see until Valeria had already claimed what was hers. But that wasn't all. Robert cleared his throat and informed us there was a second document, a sealed envelope that my mother had insisted be opened only after the will was read. He held it up, thick, cream-colored, my mother's handwriting on the front. And I knew, with a certainty that sat in my stomach like a stone, that whatever was inside that envelope would make the will look like a kindness. Robert Hendricks slid his thumb under the flap of the envelope, and the sound it made, that dry, papery whisper, was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Time did that strange thing where it stretches and compresses simultaneously, and I became aware of everything in the room at once. The hum of the radiator, the way Valeria had stopped blinking, the tiny tremor in the lawyer's fingers as he unfolded the pages inside. He read the first line to himself. Then he removed his glasses, polished them on his tie, and put them back on. Robert Hendricks had been practicing estate law for 34 years. I found out later he'd never once done that in front of a client. "This is," he said, and then stopped. "This is unusual. I want you to imagine sitting in a leather chair that costs more than your first car, watching a man you've known for 11 minutes decide whether to detonate the rest of your life. Because that's what was happening. He was deciding. Not what the document said. The document said what it said, and nothing was going to change that. He was deciding how to tell me. That's the part I remember most. Not the words themselves, but the way he looked at me before he said them. The way a doctor looks at you right before he says the word malignant. The second document was a sworn affidavit signed by my mother and notarized 6 months before her death. In it, she detailed a series of allegations against me. She claimed I had been financially exploiting her for years. She claimed I had isolated her from friends and family. She claimed I had forged her signature on multiple documents, including, and this was where Robert's voice actually cracked, including the power of attorney she had supposedly granted me. None of it was true, not a single word. But she had written it down, and she had signed it, and she had paid a notary to watch her do it, which meant that in the eyes of the law, it wasn't a lie. It was testimony. She had spent the last 6 months of her life building a case against me. While I was driving her to chemotherapy, while I was picking up her prescriptions and cooking her meals and sitting beside her bed watching game shows she couldn't follow anymore. She had been on the phone with Robert. She had been drafting language. She had been making absolutely certain that after she was gone, I would have nothing. Not just no inheritance, no reputation, no credibility, nothing. The affidavit went on to state that any previous will favoring me was invalid because it had been procured under duress. It requested that Valeria Santos, as the sole rightful heir, pursue legal action to recover any assets I had misappropriated during the years I'd served as my mother's caregiver. That word, misappropriated. Like I'd been embezzling from a corporation instead of buying my mother's groceries with my own debit card because she said she was short that month. The same months, I now understood, when those $1,500 checks were flying out of her account to Valeria. Robert finished reading, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that has a temperature. Cold. Very cold. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it. If you found out tomorrow that someone you had loved and trusted and rearranged your entire life for had been quietly dismantling you, legally, financially, emotionally, would you fight? Or would you walk away? Because I asked myself that question in Robert Hendricks's office, and the answer I gave surprised even me. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you've ever been the one expected to just accept it. The one expected to be the bigger person while someone else burned your house down. I see you. I was you. And what I did next, I'm not saying it was the right thing, but it was mine, and I'm going to tell you every single detail. Valeria spoke first after the affidavit was read. She leaned forward in her chair, her expression arranged into something she probably thought looked sympathetic, and said, "Claire, I had no idea she was going to do this. Please believe me." I looked at her. I looked at Robert. I looked at the notarized affidavit sitting on the conference table, my mother's signature curling at the bottom like a final, elegant dismissal. And I said nothing. Because here's what I understood in that moment, with a clarity so sharp it felt almost surgical. The affidavit didn't just accuse me. It accused me of things that, if investigated, could destroy my life. I worked in finance. A forgery allegation, even an unproven one, would cost me my job, my reputation, my ability to ever work in my field again. My mother had known that. She had chosen allegations that weren't just cruel, they were strategic. She had weaponized her own death to ruin me. Robert cleared his throat and said he would need to provide copies of both documents to all parties. He said Valeria had 30 days to decide whether she intended to pursue the claims in the affidavit. He said I should probably consult my own attorney. He said a lot of things, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was staring at the envelope, at my mother's handwriting, at the way she'd written my name on the outside, Claire, the exact same way she'd written it on lunch bags and birthday cards and Christmas presents for 41 years. The handwriting hadn't changed, only everything else had. I stood up. I took the copy of the affidavit Robert handed me. I walked out of the conference room, past the leather chairs, past the mahogany paneling, past Valeria, who was still arranging her face into sympathy. I made it to my car before I started shaking, and it was there, sitting in the parking lot of a law office, with my mother's betrayal in a manila folder on the passenger seat, that I remembered something. Something small. Something my mother had said to me once, years ago, when I'd asked about the cedar chest in the hall closet. She'd laughed and said, "Oh, that old thing. Don't worry about that. There's nothing in there but old letters." Old letters, of course. But letters go both ways. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a door I hadn't even known was there swung quietly open. Because if my mother had saved Valeria's letters, and I was now certain she had, then I might not be as powerless as the affidavit assumed. And Valeria, sitting smug in that office with her expensive dress and her rehearsed sympathy, had no idea what I was about to find. I drove back to my mother's house, her house now, Valeria's house, I didn't know what to call it anymore, with the affidavit sliding across the passenger seat every time I turned a corner. The sun had broken through the gray, and the whole world looked washed clean, which felt like an insult. You know those days when the weather refuses to match what's happening inside you? That was this day. I let myself in with the key I'd had since I was 19. The house was quiet in that particular way empty houses are quiet. Not peaceful, just waiting. The cedar chest was exactly where it had always been, pushed against the wall of the hall closet behind my mother's winter coats. I dragged it out and set it in the middle of the living room floor. Then I opened it, and I started to read. The letters from Valeria filled the bottom third of the chest, bundled by year with the same pale blue ribbon my mother used for everything. There were more than 40 of them. Some were short thank you notes for gifts or checks. Some were long, rambling confessions about her life, her marriages, her children. But it was the letters from the last 2 years that stopped my heart. The ones dated after my mother got sick. They were about me. I won't read them to you verbatim. Some things don't deserve to be repeated. But the gist was this. Valeria had been feeding my mother a narrative for years, a slow drip of poison delivered in careful cursive. She told my mother I was controlling. She told my mother I was greedy. She told my mother I complained about the cost of her medications, the medications I was paying for. She told my mother I was waiting for her to die so I could take everything. And my mother, lonely and sick and drowning in the guilt of having given this woman up decades earlier, had believed every single word. And then I found the letter that changed everything, the one dated 7 months ago, the one where Valeria wrote, "Patricia, I know this is hard to hear, but I've been doing some research. If Claire has been handling your finances, there's a very real possibility she's been taking more than you know. I think you need to protect yourself. I think you need to make some changes. I can help you find a lawyer. I've already found one. His name is Robert Hendricks." She had planted the idea. She had found the lawyer. She had drafted the blueprint. And my mother, terrified and vulnerable and desperate to make amends with the daughter she'd lost, had followed it. The mother I'd been loving had become a weapon in someone else's hands, and I hadn't even known the war had started. This is the part of the story where I want to tell you to pay attention to your instincts, because when I read that letter, something clicked into place that I'd been feeling for months but couldn't name. The way my mother had started asking strange questions about money. The way she'd pulled back from me physically, flinching at my touch like I was a stranger. I had thought it was the illness, the medications, the fear. And some of it probably was. But some of it was Valeria. Some of it was a daughter who had never once driven my mother to chemotherapy, sitting in her living room 3 states away, writing letters that dismantled me word by word. If you've ever been the subject of a whisper campaign you didn't know was happening, and so many of us have, you understand the particular horror of realizing you've been losing a game you didn't even know you were playing. Drop a raised hand emoji if you've been there. You're not alone in it. I sat on my mother's living room floor for a long time. The afternoon light shifted, went golden, started to fade. I read every letter twice. I took photos with my phone. I made notes. And then I did the first thing that mattered. I called a lawyer. Not a family lawyer, not an estate lawyer, a forensic accountant. Someone who could trace every dollar that had ever moved between my mother's accounts and Valeria's hands. Because here was the thing I realized, sitting on that floor with 40-something letters spread around me like evidence at a crime scene. Valeria had been collecting $1,500 a month for 12 years. That was $180,000. But the letters made it clear she'd also received lump sums: $10,000 for a car, $15,000 for a divorce attorney, $8,000 for a vacation she'd described as healing. And none of that money had been declared. None of it had been taxed. None of it was legal. Valeria had been so focused on taking me down that she'd built her entire inheritance on a foundation of what looked, to someone who knew what to look for, an awful lot like elder financial exploitation. The thing my mother had accused me of doing, Valeria had actually done, and I could prove it. But wait, because I haven't told you the worst part yet. The part that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. In one of the last letters, dated just 3 weeks before my mother died, Valeria had written something that made everything else, the will, the affidavit, the jewelry box, look almost gentle by comparison. She had written, "Patricia, I've been thinking about the house. You said Claire has a key. What if she does something? What if she takes things that belong to us before anything is official? I really think you should consider changing the locks. I really think you should make sure she can't get in." Us. She had written the word us. And my mother, my dying, confused, manipulated mother, had changed the locks 2 days later and never told me. I found the receipt in the same chest, tucked into an envelope with the locksmith's logo. She had locked me out of the house I'd grown up in, the house I'd cleaned and maintained and visited every single week for 12 years. And Valeria had made her do it, with nothing more than ink and paper and the patient, relentless cruelty of someone who knew exactly which strings to pull. The forensic accountant's name was Miriam Okonkwo, and I chose her because her website described her as someone who specialized in untangling complex family financial disputes. Complex, that was one word for it. I met her in a coffee shop 3 days after I found the letters, carrying a tote bag full of bank statements, the copies of the checks from the cedar chest, and every photograph I'd taken of Valeria's correspondence. Miriam was in her 50s, wore glasses with tortoiseshell frames, and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had seen every possible way one human being can defraud another and was no longer surprised by any of it. She spread the documents across 2 tables pushed together and read in silence for almost an hour. I sat across from her, nursing a cold latte, watching her face for reactions. There were none. The woman had a poker face that would have made a spy nervous. Finally, she removed her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and said, "Claire, I need to be honest with you. What your mother did with the will, that's difficult to contest. Undue influence cases are notoriously hard to prove when the influencer is already dead and the influenced party can't testify. But what Valeria did?" She tapped the stack of checks. "This is different. This is measurable. And measurable means winnable." What followed was 6 weeks of forensic reconstruction. Miriam traced every check, every wire transfer, every lump sum my mother had ever sent to Valeria. She cross-referenced dates with my mother's medical records. She pulled phone records. She built a timeline so detailed I could see, almost day by day, how Valeria's influence had tightened around my mother like a net. And then she found it. The thing that changed the legal calculus entirely. In the 18 months before my mother died, Valeria had written 12 checks from my mother's account. Not checks my mother had written and given her, checks Valeria had written herself, using my mother's checkbook, signing my mother's name. 12 checks totaling $94,000, and every single one had been cashed into an account in Valeria's name. She hadn't just manipulated my mother, she had stolen from her. While my mother was sick, while my mother was confused, while my mother was taking medications that had impaired judgment printed right on the orange bottle. Valeria had reached into my mother's bank account and helped herself. And the only reason she'd gotten away with it was because I'd trusted my mother to manage her own finances and had never once thought to look. Miriam filed the report on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, my new attorney, a sharp woman named Elaine, who Miriam had recommended, had filed a counterclaim in probate court. We weren't just contesting the will. We were filing a civil suit for elder financial abuse. We were filing a complaint with the State Bar Association about Robert Hendricks, who, it turned out, had been recommended to my mother by Valeria herself, and had never once questioned the circumstances under which his elderly, cancer-stricken client had suddenly decided to disinherit the daughter who was providing her daily care. And we were requesting an emergency freeze on Valeria's assets, all of them, pending a full investigation. I want you to imagine the look on Valeria's face when she was served. Actually, I don't have to imagine it. Elaine had the process server wear a body camera. I've watched it. It's remarkable. Her mouth opened and closed 3 times before any sound came out, and when it did, it was a single word. What? Not why, not this is a mistake. What? Like she genuinely could not comprehend that the woman she'd been trying to destroy had simply turned around and started documenting. If you're sitting there right now, thinking about someone in your life who's gotten away with something, someone who's lied about you or taken what wasn't theirs, or manipulated someone you love, I want you to hear what I'm about to say. The thing that saved me wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a courtroom speech. It was a paper trail. It was patience. It was a forensic accountant with steady hands who charged $200 an hour and was worth 10 times that. Around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it, and we document it. Every single time. The probate hearing was set for 8 weeks out. Valeria's lawyer, she'd hired someone new after it became clear Robert was sinking, requested a continuance. Denied. She requested mediation. We said no. Because here's what I understood by then. Valeria had spent 12 years working a long game. She had been patient. She had been strategic. She had planted seeds in my mother's mind and watered them for more than a decade. The only way to beat someone like that wasn't to out-emote her. It was to out-document her. To build a case so airtight that her own narrative couldn't breathe inside it. And that's exactly what we did. 3 weeks before the hearing, something unexpected happened. Valeria called me. Directly. Not through lawyers. My phone rang, and there was her name on the screen. And I answered because I wanted to hear whatever she was going to say. She was crying. Real tears or manufactured, I still don't know. She told me she'd never meant for any of this to happen. She told me my mother had come to her, not the other way around. She told me the money was a gift, that my mother had insisted, that she'd never asked for any of it. She told me I was being cruel. I let her talk. I let her finish. And then I said, Valeria, you told my dying mother to change the locks so I couldn't get into her house. You wrote the words. I have them in your handwriting. You don't get to call me cruel." The line went quiet. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone realizing they'd run out of moves. Then she hung up. And that was the last time I ever heard her voice. But the story doesn't end there. Because what happened at the probate hearing was not what anyone expected. Not me, not Elaine, not Valeria. My mother, it turned out, had one more secret left. And it was waiting for all of us in a safety deposit box that no one, not me, not Valeria, not even Robert Hendricks, had known existed. The safety deposit box was discovered by a bank employee during a routine audit. My mother had opened it 16 years earlier, shortly after my father died, and had apparently never mentioned it to anyone. Not to me, not to Robert Hendricks, not to Valeria. The bank sent a certified letter to the executor of the estate, which by that point was neither me nor Valeria, but a court-appointed neutral third party, assigned after our legal battle turned the probate case into what the judge had described, with audible exhaustion, as a matter requiring extraordinary oversight. I love that phrase. Extraordinary oversight. Translation: this family has burned the courthouse down, and someone needs to sift through the ashes. Elaine called me on a Tuesday. "Claire," she said, and her voice had a quality I'd never heard in it before. Surprise, maybe, or something softer. "You need to come to my office. There's something in the box, something your mother left." I drove there in the same car I'd sat shaking in 8 months earlier. The manila folder of my mother's affidavit, now replaced by a file box of evidence Miriam had assembled. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I had arrived at this fight with nothing but grief and a sense of betrayal so vast I couldn't see its edges. I was arriving at this moment with something else entirely. Proof. And the truth, however complicated, was finally on my side. Elaine's conference room table was covered in documents, but in the center, cleared of everything else, sat a single item: a letter. Not like the ones from the cedar chest, not pale blue ribbon and careful cursive. This was on plain white paper, typed, dated 3 years before my mother got sick. Elaine handed it to me without a word, and I read it standing up because I was too anxious to sit. It was addressed to me. My mother had written that she knew she was difficult. She wrote that she'd never been good at showing love, but that she'd felt it. Felt it every time I showed up, every time I called, every time I chose her, even when she made it hard. She wrote that she was proud of me in ways she couldn't articulate, and that she'd never found the courage to say it out loud. She wrote that the jewelry box was mine, that it had always been mine, that she wanted me to have it and everything in it, and that the note tucked inside, the one I'd found after her death, was a draft of a letter she'd written to Valeria years earlier, during a period she described as trying to fix a mistake I made before you were born. She'd kept it, she said, to remind herself of a version of herself she'd chosen not to become. The note wasn't meant for me. It was never meant for me. It was a relic of a conversation she decided not to have. She'd tucked it into the jewelry box and forgotten it was there. And I had found it and built an entire cathedral of pain around something that was never supposed to be mine to read. I don't know how to describe what I felt in that moment. It wasn't relief. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something in between, the emotional equivalent of a door opening in a room you'd thought was a wall. My mother had still done what she'd done. She'd still rewritten her will under Valeria's influence. She'd still signed an affidavit full of lies. She'd still changed the locks. The last years of her life had still been twisted by a woman who saw her not as a mother, but as a resource. None of that was erased by a letter written in clearer times. But the letter proved something I hadn't let myself believe for months. That before the sickness, before the manipulation, before Valeria tightened her grip, my mother had known who I was, and she had loved me. The probate hearing ended in a split decision. The judge ruled that the will signed during my mother's illness was invalid due to undue influence. The letters from Valeria, the checks she'd written to herself, the testimony from my mother's oncologist about her cognitive state during the months in question. It all added up to a picture the court couldn't ignore. The house went to me. The savings, what was left of them, were divided. The affidavit was struck from the record. But the earlier will, the one my mother had drafted before Valeria entered her life, that one stood. And in that will, my mother had left Valeria nothing. Valeria received nothing. Not the jewelry box, not the house, not the money she'd spent 12 years positioning herself to inherit. She was ordered to repay the $94,000 she'd taken, plus interest, and the civil suit Miriam's report had triggered was referred to the district attorney's office for consideration. The last I heard, she was living in a rented apartment 2 towns over, working as a receptionist at a dental practice, and telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen her inheritance. Some stories don't end with an apology. They end with a boundary, and that's enough. I kept the letter, not the note from the jewelry box, the real letter, the typed one from the safety deposit box. It sits in my nightstand now. I don't read it often, but I know it's there. And that's the thing I want to leave you with tonight. The people we love are complicated. They will hurt us, sometimes in ways that feel irreparable. And we will hurt them too, even when we're trying our hardest not to. But truth has a way of surfacing. It might take a safety deposit box and a forensic accountant and 8 months of legal battles, but it surfaces. What you do with it when it arrives, that's the only part you can control.
If this story found you in the middle of your own fight, if you're sitting there feeling erased, manipulated, or outmaneuvered by someone who's rewritten the narrative to make you the villain, hear me when I say this. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find your Miriam. You don't have to fight the way they're fighting. You just have to be more thorough. Around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it. And then, we let it go. The firelight is always on. I'll see you next time.